I'm going to see if Director Mitchell is on with us and if she'd like to kick us off.
I am here, Jen, I just want to thank everybody who's here today, especially our elected officials who are here to learn some more about the project. Your input is very important to us, and we appreciate the opportunity to brief you on where we are with the study right now. And I want to thank the team that's here as well for all the hard work that they've done. So with that, Jen, I will turn it back to you and the team.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. So I'm going to walk through today's presentation. I'm also joined by Tim Roseboom, who is DRPT's project manager, and Ciara Williams, who has managed the land use element of the study, as well as our awesome consultant team from Cambridge Systematics. We have Dahlia Levin and I'm having a moment. Tom Harrington, thank you. Tom Harrington are also on the call with us, as well as our partners from McGuire Woods who have helped with the legal analysis that is part of what we're presenting to you today. So we're going to start off today's presentation and give you an update on our public outreach and our stakeholder outreach. I'll go back over a quick summary of the evaluation results that we shared in the briefing that we held last month. But today, really the meat and the new content of today's conversation is going to be talking about some of the other considerations that are that we need to talk about around Metrorail extensions, and also to share some order of magnitude costs for consideration. So just want to remind everybody of our technical approach. We have taken this study in two parallel paths. We've done a very traditional transit analysis, looking at needs, defining some transit alternatives, testing those, and then getting us down to where we are today with findings. But at the same time, we also looked in a parallel track at some different land use scenarios and looked at how land use could impact a potential feasibility, ridership of any transit expansion in the corridor. We tested those scenarios, and really those two elements of the study come back together in what we're sharing today. In terms of our schedule, we are nearing the end of our study process. We started this about a year ago. We've worked through, I think this is either our fourth or fifth elected officials briefing. But we've gone through a real detailed process to define our needs, develop and test those transit land use alternatives, document the costs, the benefits, and the feasibility of those alternatives. And we are getting right down to the wire in terms of getting the report prepared to be submitted to the General Assembly by December 1st. So we are closing in on the finish line. So as we have in each of these briefings, I want to start off and talk about our public and stakeholder outreach. And as the director said, input is so critical to us, and being able to hear from the public and from our agency stakeholder partners and from elected officials throughout the process is extremely helpful and continues to be extremely helpful as we hone in on our final report. We've completed a number of activities. That completed list gets longer each time we talk, and the upcoming list gets much shorter. We've had a technical advisory committee comprised of our local government and agency stakeholders that have met at least on a monthly basis since the beginning of the study. We've had these elected officials briefings. We have a website that we continuously add information to on the study, including our project fact sheet. We did an online survey that had an incredible response. We got a lot of good information out of that online survey and had well over 1,200 responses to that survey. We had a couple of pop-up events in the corridor, and then we had a series of public meetings. We were really hopeful that we could have some of those public meetings in person, but unfortunately they were all virtual. The first round being in May, second in July, and then we had two public meetings last month in September. So what we have left in terms of that public outreach is to post and solicit public input on our draft report as we wrap up the study process. So I want to talk a little bit about the September public meetings. The last briefing we had was the week, end of the week before these public meetings. We held one on a Tuesday evening, one on a Thursday evening. We did have for Tuesday night, we had 45 individuals register and 23 participate, and those are 23 members of the public, so that doesn't include our staff and our consultant team. Thursday night, we had 40 register and we had 24 participate. We did receive requests and did provide closed captioning services for those meetings, and we also provided Spanish language interpretation. We did, I mentioned earlier, we had some pop-ups. Those pop-ups were specifically focused on getting folks to participate in these meetings. So those pop-ups were held at the Franconia Springfield Metro Station and the PRTC Transit Center in the weeks leading up to those public meetings. Because we were in a virtual format, but we still had kind of small groups, we did some breakout groups in the Tuesday night session, and we did more of a large group discussion in the Thursday night session. We did get some really good questions and some valuable input as part of that process. So some of the things that we heard and some of the questions that we got a lot of questions about assumptions and really details about each of these alternatives that we've evaluated. Very detailed questions about design and configuration of the BRT option, like what it would look like, questions about what a Metrorail extension would look like, whether it would be at grade or whether it would be elevated. We got questions about what actions that the counties could take regarding land use, because we did talk about land use in those meetings. We also had good participation from folks on the southern end of the corridor that were looking for more direct transit connections in the town of Quantico. We also had a number of questions about VRE, and I think one of the things that's been interesting to navigate through the study process is there are already so many amazing things going on in the corridor with the Transforming Rail in Virginia effort and the VRE capacity improvements that are coming along with Transforming Rail in Virginia, and the fact that all of those are incorporated as something that is going to be in place, so they are assumed in the baseline for this study. So that's a little confusing when we have those projects that are in development in the corridor, but they're not out there yet, and how those are reflected in this study. So we answered some questions related to that. We talked a little bit about where the alternatives came from, and we talked about some different questions, because we have that little bit of a hook in the blue line option that we tested that serves the northern end of Fort Belvoir. We also talked about how and had questions about BRT relative to Metro in terms of timing and serving as a precursor to Metro. So we had a really good dialogue. It was a good opportunity to really hear from the public and get some of those questions. Some of them are hard to answer because this is we're very early in talking about all of these alternatives. And so a lot of the questions, and this is where it's hard engaging the public, it's hard to answer some of those specific questions because those are questions that aren't going to be able to be answered until a path is chosen in terms of what type of transit expansion is desired in the corridor, and then there's some more specific environmental and engineering work to get those projects advanced. So I'm just going to do a refresher on our evaluation results because that is so important in terms of the feasibility element of the study. So we, from the beginning, from those early public meetings, from the survey, we did hear very loud and clear about enhanced public transit needs in the corridor. We heard about how the existing transit services don't necessarily serve all trips well. They serve some trips very well, but not all trips. How transit may need some enhancement as the area continues to grow and see a lot of growth. In order to support that future development, transit is definitely part of that equation. We heard that transit can help improve equity in making connections to communities and also making connections to our activity centers. We've got big activity centers in this corridor, including Fort Belvoir and Quantico, as well as other major employers where there's not really good transit connection and accessibility today. I think we can all acknowledge that traffic congestion in the corridor it's tough, and it's going to continue to be a point of conversation into the future. So the time to have a conversation about alternatives and enhancing transit is now. We also heard about accessibility to the transit services that are in place and how important it is going to be to have good accessibility to transit into the future. So we looked at 5 different alternatives. We looked at 2 options for Metrorail extension, a blue line extension and a yellow line extension. We looked at a bus rapid transit option. And then as I mentioned already, the big expansion associated with the transforming rail in Virginia for the VRE corridor is already part of the baseline of the study. But we did look at some small VRE service improvements above what those commitments would be. And also looked at expansion of Express Bus, which is already very prevalent in this corridor. In terms of feasibility, there's lots of different ways to look at feasibility and lots of different metrics that we can apply. So as we look at the different options, we looked at ridership potential. We looked at the impact that those alternatives would have on mitigating congestion. We looked at how different alternatives would improve regional accessibility, connections to jobs, connections to activity centers, and helping to fill any gaps in accessibility. We looked at equity, and we also looked at cost effectiveness. So I'm quickly going to clip through a couple of slides, really focused on the 2 Metrorail alternatives and the BRT, just because that's where and I think that's where a lot of the conversation and the study has focused. So starting with the blue line, so the blue line is the blue line on the map. This is the alternative that we evaluated. And when you see the circles on the map, those are anticipated station locations. The size of that circle and the depth of the color of that circle indicate how, the growth or the anticipated number of daily boardings in that location. So the larger the circle, the deeper the color, that's more people that would access the service at that location. Same type of graphic for the yellow line. For the yellow line, we also see those same circles. The larger circles and the depth of color indicates how many riders would board at those locations. High activity locations in the yellow line are on the northern end, where the BRT project is already in development with Fairfax County and North Woodbridge. For both this and the blue line alternative, we really do see those number of boardings and the demand for those services to drop off south of the Potomac Town Center. I'm going to do a quick check. Tim, is the slide on yellow now? Okay, thank you. There's a tad bit of a delay, so I will try to slow down and make sure my computer catches up with what I'm talking about. Not let my slides lag too far behind. So I'm going to move on to BRT. Same kind of graphic. Purple line is the BRT corridor that we looked at in terms of evaluating for those metrics. The circles show you the station locations. With BRT, we can have a lot more potential station stops, which does increase the accessibility of the service. You see those larger circles and the darker colors, more so on the northern end of the corridor. And much like with the Metrorail alternatives that we tested, that ridership demand does drop off the further south, particularly once you get south of Potomac. Town Center does drop off as you head south towards Dumfries and Triangle. So the slide on the screen at a very high level summarizes those evaluation results and what we saw as we looked at the different alternatives. With each of these alternatives, there are trade-offs in each one of them. The VRE service or additional VRE service above transforming rail in Virginia and additional express bus don't have an infrastructure component. So the cost may be lower, but the number of people and the impact and the ability to move the needle in terms of congestion may be less when you look at the number of riders than maybe some of the other alternatives that would be opening up territory that doesn't currently have a high capacity transit alternative right there in that immediate area. So we did see some different like I said, there's trade-offs, and we did see some different pros and cons with each of the alternatives that were evaluated. And Before we move on, I'm going to pause there since I went through that much faster than we did last time and at a very high level. I just want to pause and say, do we have any questions on either the public outreach or the evaluation before we move into some new content that we haven't shared with you before?
Jennifer, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, good afternoon. My apologies for being a little detained. Could you just expound a little bit for me, if you would? If you go back, the slide that said in reference to Quantico needed more connectors.
That was one of the items that came up in our in the public comment, and I'll ask Tom and Tim if you want to jump into that. I believe, if I recall correctly, it was connections, because the base kind of surrounds the town, and there's an issue of getting through base and providing that transit access. But Tom or Tim, I defer to you to expound on that a little more.
I appreciate it. I'm sorry if it's a remedial question, but I just was interested to know.
No, it's a good question.
Yeah, Jen, this Tim, that is the issue, and I think also with Fort Belvoir, you have to distribute people on base, so you could have a rail station at one or two of the entrances, but you still have an issue of circulation on base. I don't know, Tom, if you want to add anything.
No, I think that captured it.
Great. Delegate Guzman, I think I see your hand raised. Feel free to unmute and go ahead with your question.
Sure. Thank you, Jennifer. It's for me, and maybe I'm just coming at the end of the process. I apologize. I've been in and out different meetings, but I think it would be possible, if it's possible, to draw a map with the three colors together, so we can see the differences in between the blue, the yellow, and the purple, because it was hard to follow from one map to the next. And so we can see the differences, because from what I remember is that the three of them will have the same track, right? And it's like they are competing against each other, with the difference that the rapid transit, which will be just the extension of what is already approved in Fairfax County. Now, when I am looking at the summary of evaluation results, I would like to know more of how this was presented to the public, because it's like, how do they compete, right? How do they prefer to vote for the yellow line versus the blue line, or how do they prefer the BRT? You know, and I look at the ratings and they're very similar, and of course, cost effectiveness on the BRT wins, but it's just how it was presented to the public so they could vote for that. If you can expand on that. Thank you.
So we did not do a vote per se with the public on the different alternatives. So, and what we presented to them had a lot more slides. We've cut this down because we went through the evaluation with this group a little bit, I guess, the last meeting, and so we did walk through that in a lot more detail. Tom, do you want to touch a little bit more on the difference in terms of the evaluation and some of what we've heard from the public about the differences between the options?
George Carter is now joining.
Sure thing. Yeah, I mean, in the discussions in the public meetings, I thought, as we mentioned, we got some good questions about, you know, in which situations would Metrorail, you know, perform well, and which situations BRT or some of the other options would perform well. We didn't, you know, as Jen said, we didn't have anyone vote on the options per se. I think there was definitely interest in having improved transit accessibility, but that's pretty generic. You know, I don't think we had a lot of discussions per se about a preferred option at this point, and I think that's probably something that would come later in a future planning process in terms of type of feedback. We did get some feedback through the survey in the spring in terms of how, you know, people's preferences, and we heard some you know, support for a number of the options, including BRT and Metrorail.
And may I follow up just on the, because when I'm looking at the blue line versus the yellow line, On the yellow line, we're looking at an extension of the Huntington, right? That's the last station that we have on the yellow line, versus the blue line, where the last station is Springfield. So if we're looking at expansion, I mean, from my point of view, and a commuter, and I know many of this room are the same, I could, easily see a possibility of two different tracks. I mean, one that comes, on Route 1, which is the yellow line, but then from Springfield, we could easily go to on a different side of Fullerton, where there's also audience, and then from there you can go, to Lake Ridge or Montclair, and then go to Potomac Mills, which is a completely different track. So it's hard for me to describe that we don't need both. What I would like to see is doing both and in different tracks, and how that conversation happened, if somebody can tell me more.
So we'll touch on the next steps in the process, like after we finish this study, where we could, or where the localities could go from here in terms of next steps. So we'll hit on that towards the end of the presentation. So if you don't mind, we'll come back to that, if that's okay.
Sure, no problem.
We have a map with all the alternatives on it together. We just didn't put it in today's deck. So we'll make sure that'll be in the draft report. So you'll be able to see how those lines compare. There is a lot of overlap from basically Woodbridge south. It is essentially the same corridor. The real differences in the different alignments are north of there.
All right, yes, because that's what I would like to see, right? When it was presented, how did the track work? I'm just going by the maps that you gave us. So if you can give us more information, that would be awesome. I can wait.
Thank you. All right, so the next thing we wanted to jump into today is talk about some of the other considerations. And I think this gets to, where do you go from here? Because this study and the charge of the study was to look at really the art of the possible in the corridor. What the demand is, what the options are, what could happen. And then from where we end with this study, then some decisions are going to have to be made, Delegate Guzman, to your point about where you go next and what you look at next as you proceed towards project development. With Metrorail, that has some additional considerations because Metrorail is an interstate contract. It's not just something that we decide and we work on here in Virginia. So we had McGuire Woods on our team to help do some analysis of some of those legal considerations. So just let me start from here. And if you look at the Silver Line and the extension with the Silver Line out to Ashburn, and you draw a line as the crow flies back to L'Enfant, that's about almost 27 miles. So when you look at that compared to what we're talking about from L'Enfant south to Potomac Mills or down to Triangle, we're talking about a 23 to a 29 mile corridor. So this is a lengthy Metrorail extension that we're talking about, and it would be a significant addition to the metro system. Anytime you talk to Metro about any kind of addition to the metro system, Metro is very quick, and rightfully so, to point out that there's core capacity needs in the central core of the metro system that need to be addressed first before we add more capacity coming in from the outer edges of the system. And so that's core capacity where all those lines come together in the district. And that's also addressing the congestion that we have where the blue, orange, and silver lines come together through the Roslyn Tunnel into the district. So those are things that Metro's working on studies right now for the blue, orange, silver line, blue, orange, silver study. So those needs are going to need to be addressed first before we talk about another lengthy expansion. There are also some legal and governance implications of adding Prince William County to the metro system. Talk about that more in a minute, as well as an perpetually ongoing annual capital and operating commitment in terms of a subsidy contribution that would have to come from Prince William County, and also an increase in what Fairfax County already pays into the metro system on an annual basis. So those are all things that have to be considered as we talk about metro expansion. Senator Surville, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, could we let's go backwards a second. I guess I won't turn my camera on. But on the sheet you had up a minute ago that compared the various alternatives, the ones with the stars on it, you know what I'm talking about? Where it talked about no. Oh, well, you know, the one that evaluated the ridership potential, congestion mitigation, regional access, equity, cost effectiveness.
Yes, it should be back on the screen.
Oh, is it? Okay, I switched over. Right. So in the presentation that you all gave us last month, bus rapid transit got an equity score of 2. It seems to have morphed into equal equity with Metro in the last 30 days. And I'm curious how that transformation occurred. And
great question.
And then secondly, I also wanted to confirm that when you all talk about cost effectiveness, you're not considering in any way the sort of climate change mitigation or the improved health outcomes or everything else that's associated with you know, housing densities and commuting by train, as opposed to the housing densities and all the other externalities that are associated with lower density alternatives like buses and Fury.
So you are incredibly observant, and so I'm going to ask Tom to explain the additional star that we added on the BRT alternative, and he can also address cost effectiveness as well.
Sure. Yeah, and I think one, when looking at a chart like this, a summary type chart, you lose some of the detail. And so for the equity measures, we had actually multiple equity measures that we discussed. I think it was at the July public meetings. So for equity, we had 2 types of measures. We had one that was really on how well we get access to regional jobs for the residents of equity emphasis areas. And on that measure, the Metrorail options did perform best. They clearly increased job accessibility the most. But we had another measure, which was walk access to transit. And so the BRT had rated best in terms of percent of the people that could walk to BRT that are from those equity emphasis areas. And so as we were preparing the executive summary report, we realized that oversight, that given that it had rated best on one of the measures and Metro on the other, it seemed that they should have the same rating. So again, when we lay this out in the report, we note both of those things, so it'll be a little more clear sort of how it builds up to the score. Yeah, in terms of cost effectiveness, I think your question was really how do we bring in all these other benefits that potentially, you know, an economist could monetize, and we could look at all that. And I will say our cost effectiveness is pretty straightforward in terms of really trips per annual dollars, and we're going to talk more about annual dollars in a minute. So that's how it was measured here, you know, but recognizing that really all of the benefits that we look at would be part of that equation of looking at the cost and what you get in terms of investing in transportation.
Okay, thanks. I would just note I think one of the big mistakes we've made in this country over the last 100 years is not looking at the true cost of our infrastructure decisions, and transit by far has been shown to have not only a lot less climate impact when you build a lot of people and build tall buildings around transit and you put them on a train and they drive in and use a lot less energy. There's just a lot less carbon generated, but people who use transit and walk tend to lead healthier lives than others, and I would say probably better than express bus users and others. And when we continue to ignore those types of costs, we tend to get these analyses that look at the most observable immediate costs as opposed to the true cost. And as long as we keep evaluating things that way, we're going to keep getting the same outcomes, I think, in terms of looking at those. But and also on the equity piece, I'm not sure exactly what assumptions underlie the how many people in equity areas could walk to a station. But I would agree that if our localities continue to refuse to put real money into affordable housing, there'll be problems. But I think when you look at the kind of investments that DC and other parts of the country are making in affordable housing, and what I hope our localities in Northern Virginia will do in the future as they wake up to the need for affordable housing near transit, that you will see a lot more housing available to lower income families or equity communities next to metro stations, and not just, on bus routes where it's cheapest to build. So I think there's, obviously some assumptions that underlie those ideas that are, packed into it that sort of skew the results in some way. I have a hard time seeing bus rapid transit as having the exact same equity score as the metro line. And when you frame it this way, it looks to try to preordain an outcome, which I think all of us elected officials would much rather see metro be the ultimate outcome and not bus rapid transit. Although I recognize that bus rapid transit's a useful bridge, but when I see these things shift around and stuff, it worries me. So just note that. Anyway, sorry, I wanted to go back to that, but we need to hop back where we were.
Very, very valid point, Senator Sorrell. We'll definitely go back and take a look at that again and make sure that we capture that feedback in the report. I think that's one of the things that has made this study process so unique is looking at the land use in parallel with the with the transit alternatives. And I think that's, we on the state side, we don't do that very often because, that is a local government decision. But it is interesting that we very clearly were able to document in those land use scenarios that, that demand and the benefits of the, potential Metrorail expansion definitely come with the changes in land use. That makes all of this much more viable. And so how those parallel pieces come together and proceed in terms of implementation is going to be interesting to see. I've got a couple of hands up. Tanya James?
I know it's showing Tanya James, but it's really Supervisor Bailey.
Okay, Supervisor Bailey, I saw you and I saw the hand up, and the name did not match. So
I know.
Go ahead.
Please forgive me to my colleagues and to this wonderful team. I apologize. My computer is very sick, and I'm doing the best I can today, technically. But thank you, Jennifer. I just wanted to. Not to expand the dialogue that Senator Sorrell just said, but I totally agree with him. And thank you for acknowledging that, Jennifer. We do need to dig a little bit deeper and look at the numbers and look at the accessibility and look at the equity piece in a more deeper dive because the traditional answers that we get on these surveys may not be the answer to the direction that we're trying to go in. And so I thank you for embracing that. And I thank Senator Sorrell for bringing that to the fore, because that was definitely going to be my comment. So if you could please just reassess, I would certainly appreciate it.
All right. Next, I think Supervisor Bodie, you have your hand up?
I do. Thank you so much, Jennifer. And to sort of piggyback off of what both Senator Sorrell and Supervisor Bailey just said, we've mentioned this in previous meetings, but Prince William County is currently going through updates of its three most important chapters, especially in this conversation, which is our mobility chapter, our land use chapter, and our housing chapter. And since we have not adopted those policies yet, there will definitely be interplay between the findings of this report and this study and what we ultimately decide to do. And in talking with our planning staff and our mobility staff, they will basically be programming flexible language into those chapters so we can jive with whatever this study finds. But that being the case, it's a chicken or egg sort of situation, right? Where we will be able to make better land use decisions based on what we know what we believe will come out of this study. But until that happens, you all are just basing your decisions based on what we currently have on the book, since our body has not adopted these new concepts yet. So just wanted to make sure that everyone has that on their radar as we continue this conversation. And to put a little bit finer point on the point that Senator Surville made, especially when it comes to delivering these kinds of things to the public, when you just sort of rate cost effectiveness. There's a lot of people out there who go, oh, well, a certain thing has more bang for my buck when it comes to my taxpayer dollars, so why should I look at anything else? Not knowing that there's a more broad and holistic long-term benefit to a particular mode of transit versus another. As Senator Surville said, and I think Delegate Guzman sort of talked about it a little bit too, we can compare all these things when it comes to a pure star rating, but when we also look and dive into things like public health, environmental benefits, or even just the fact that putting something underground or locating it along existing right-of-way has a lot of less disruption to certain communities than other types of large paving projects or some of the things that would need to be done for, especially the BRT expansion. It doesn't paint the fullest picture. And for us as elected officials and transportation nerds, we understand that. The layman and general public that's receiving this information wouldn't necessarily have the perspective to draw those conclusions. So I just wanted to add that 2 cents and just overall say that, like Senator Surville said, a lot of people have made decisions before us based on those more narrow ideas of where we're going. But especially as we look ahead at our corridor that we're looking at here being the most congested corridor in the entire country, we can't allow ourselves to be short-sighted in how we respond to this, because there are national and regional implications for the next steps after we receive this. And again, a question I had asked on a previous meeting, that we're also not accounting for existing infrastructure that we have in Prince William County or Fairfax, like our very large, very robust commuter lots that we already have that could, in some situations, be easily converted into a parking lot for a metro stop, for example, or for a park and ride for a BRT or something like that, or serve as a quick shuttle from this existing commuter lot to a metro stop. And so there's other cost savings, other considerations too, that I think that we need to keep in mind as we move further. Thank you so much again for allowing us to tune in, and for all the hard work you guys have put into this over the many months you have.
Yeah, thank you, Supervisor Bodie. I have one more hand raised, and then we're going to need to move on, because we have some really good content that's new that you haven't seen before that we want to make sure we have time to go through. So Gordon Baird, did you have a question?
Yes, and it's a technical one, so I'm hoping it will be very quick. And I apologize if this is a question that has been asked before. I got in a little later than I anticipated. But a few slides back, when you were going over the projections for potential ridership at the metro station alternatives for the blue and yellow line extensions, were the numbers informed by, or did the numbers get informed by, or was there an assumption of integration with the existing public bus services and or commuter lots, existing infrastructure like that?
Yeah, Tom, do you want to take that?
Sure. Yeah, when we tested each option, we included the full transportation system that's in the future baseline network. So that did include our bus system. It did include a few enhancements to make sure that buses connected to the new station areas. And so it's definitely possible in our forecast for riders to transfer from bus, say, to a new rail line or to the BRT. And so that was accounted for in the forecasting.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Thanks. So I'm going to move back into talking about kind of procedurally what we found in terms of, how we would potentially incorporate Prince William into the metro process. And so, like I said earlier, we had McGuire Woods help us with this element of the study. But I guess the first and foremost, the best thing to point out is that based on their analysis, extending Metrorail into Prince William is not going to require an amendment to the WMATA Compact, which is, that's a good thing, because that means we don't have to go through Virginia, Maryland, and DC. But what does need to happen is Prince William would have to become a member of the Northern Virginia Transportation District and also the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Zone. And so there's two kind of processes set for those to enlarge the Northern Virginia Transportation District. That is a process that's controlled by the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission. And so they would walk through the process of potentially adding Prince William to the district, and then they would also be the ones that would articulate what Prince William County's obligations would then be relative to NVTC and what that would look like going forward. Once that would be complete, then it would be NVTC's responsibility on behalf of Prince William County to notify WMATA that their district has been enlarged, so that they can then communicate the financial commitment of Prince William County to the Metro system as part of that notification, and then ultimately the WMATA board would have to approve the expansion of the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Zone to include Prince William County. There's a lot that goes into both of those steps, a lot of negotiation. There would be an impact because Prince William County currently is a member of the Potomac Rappahannock Transportation Commission. How that would work if Prince William County were to become a member of the Northern Virginia Transportation District, that is complex. So that obviously these are very high level, and there would have to be some negotiation that goes into both of those steps and some additional analysis to figure out and resolve what that impact would be. Also, I think we've pointed this out before, but an extension into Prince William County would include a financial commitment that would go beyond just the construction costs of an extension. And at that point, Prince William County would become part of the compact jurisdictions and would have a share of the annual operating and capital subsidy, which is based on a formula that they would be responsible for. They would have obligations to the Metro Capital Fund, which is established by state code, and then any other negotiated financial obligations. All of that would have to be worked through as any potential Metro projects would progress. So moving on to order of magnitude cost, and I think this is where I think last time we had some questions about what does the cost look like, and we were very tentative because once a number hits the screen, it's out there forever, and so we wanted to make sure that we started off in a place where it gives you as the decision makers on how whatever alternatives proceed, a good place to start, and some information. So in terms of developing cost estimate, a planning level, baseline, entry-level cost estimate for any of these alternatives, there's some specific inputs that we look at. For things like bus rapid transit and Metrorail, we're looking at fixed guideway. Mileage, we're looking at stations. We're also looking at how many new vehicles are required, and then how many more hours of operation whatever provider is involved in each alternative would have to provide that service. And then we're able to multiply those by good planning level cost factors for each one of those functions. So for the BRT and the Metrorail alternatives, all of those alternatives have fixed guideway and stations, where the BRE incremental increases and the express bus, they don't have those. Theirs are just related to the acquisition of new rolling stock, of new vehicles, new train sets in the part of BRE, and those additional hours of operation. If you recall from last time, and we didn't go through this today, but for the BRT and for the two Metrorail alternatives, we also did some sensitivity analysis to look at if we shorten the alignment. So remember, for each one of those maps, ridership really dropped off once you got south of, basically south of Potomac Mills, Potomac Town Center. So if we truncated those lines, if we made them shorter, how would that affect cost? And so, as you see on the chart, we've got, for BRT, we've got a BRT and a shortened BRT. And for Blue Line, we have Blue Line and a shortened Blue Line. And the same with Yellow Line. So that's why you see those two different column headings. So on this slide, these are our estimated costs of each alternative. We put everything in a constant $20, $30, so we're looking out into the future, and we're also giving you ranges because we are at a very initial high-level planning study, feasibility study, and right now there are a lot of unknowns in each one of these potential alternatives. So for each one, the first line, that top line there is the total capital cost range. That is looking at the capital that it takes to put those options into operation. So that's the fixed guideway, that's vehicles, that's stations. The next line is our annual operations and maintenance costs. And then finally, the annual net cost, so that's the capital plus the operating minus the fair revenue on an annualized basis. There's a lot of information on this slide, and there's some very, very large numbers on this slide. So I know this is a place where we're going to get into some more questions and discussion. So Tom and Tim, I want to make sure you guys have a much better handle on this. I wanted, before we start taking questions, which I know we're going to have, Tom or Tim, did you want to add anything on this slide before we open it up for questions?
Nothing for me, Jen. No, I think it looks good.
Yeah, and I think we'll just see what types of questions we get after the answering.
Okay. Senator Serval, did you want to go first? I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I think Guzman is ahead of me by about 5 seconds, but
I'll let you guys decide to go first.
well, I had my question was really quick, and that was, you all have some kind of a estimate of sort of how this is split between the two localities?
Tom, you want to take that one? Did we break it?
For this particular slide, the costs are just the total cost for the alternative, so there's no sort of breakdown by jurisdiction here. And again, when we talked about cost effectiveness, it's that annualized net cost number is what was used in the cost effectiveness measure. Separately, we did take a look at the operating and subsidy impacts by jurisdiction. Metro uses a formula that includes population, ridership, and number of stations. And so from that basis, there was some looking at how that breaks down by jurisdiction, kind of at a high level.
No, I understand that, but I mean, this project goes over two different jurisdictions, and I haven't played around on Google Maps and measured the mileage, but for the stations, but it looks to me like it's roughly maybe 30 or 40% in Fairfax and the rest in Prince William. But I was just trying to figure out, the share of it between the two, and I understand that one of the formulas has to do with ridership, and the ridership might be more equal or something like that once you start looking at passengers, densities and stuff. But I was just trying to get a rough sense of the cost of each jurisdiction on this.
Right. It's a little more balanced when we're looking at the shorter options. And in the short options, we have 4 new stations in Fairfax and 4 new stations in Prince William County. With the longer option, there's majority is in Prince William County.
Okay, thanks.
Delegate Guzman, would you like to give next?
I would like to know if these numbers only belong to localities. There is not participation from the federal government or state government on these numbers.
That's a great question. So these are just the overall estimated cost for the project. So, and we've got one more slide in the presentation that talks about kind of the next steps if you were going to make it a federal project to go through the capital investment grant program at the federal level. Tom, if you want to jump in and add anything else, but this, nothing that's been done would preclude, federal participation, state participation. This should not be looked at as a number that would just be on the local government.
Right. Thank you.
See, Delegate Tran.
Great, thank you so much. I think there was an earlier slide that said NVTC would help to determine the Prince William share for Metro, if I understood that correctly. Can you clarify if NVTC currently determines that for other localities as well, and what that process, or what that process looks like now? Thank you.
Tim, can you take that one?
Yeah, I see that. So the specific role for NVTC is that that would be the mechanism by how Prince William County would participate in Metro. So it's essentially a legal maneuver where NVTC would negotiate with Prince William County, come to terms on the project. They would join NVTC, and then NVTC would make a request to Metro to expand what's called the transit zone, the area where they can legally operate services. It would expand Prince William County. The actual formula of how the operating subsidy would be divided up, that is based on factors like the number of stations, population density. There's a factor, ridership, and then there's a factor called maximum fare. People paying the long distance fare. So the operating costs would be divided up that way. NVTC does, for the station that passes through the locality to Metro, NVTC does decide how that. They do have a formula that decides how that money is distributed, and it takes into account DRB's capital program and a number of other factors.
Any other questions before we move on to the last couple slides in our deck? All right. So,
Jennifer, I'm sorry. I had a question.
Go ahead.
Y'all have any sense of how much of this has to do with getting across the Occoquan? I mean, I know bridges tend to cost more than putting things in the ground, and getting over that gorge can't be cheap. And so how much was in that, you know?
So we're not at a level of planning where we would get into, like, as I said earlier, how much of even the alignment would be aerial versus at grade.
Okay.
So these are real planning level estimates. I think and we'll touch on briefly here as we talk about next steps is, as whatever selected alignment or alignments would move forward for further development, those kinds of questions start to.
Okay, I understand. So in other words, I mean, the kinds of metrics I've heard thrown around is that metro costs, or rail costs, like $500 million per mile or something, and each station costs like $500 million. I've heard those numbers thrown around in the past in prior discussions over the last 10 years. My assumption is that you guys are using measures like that to make these decisions, and that's also why you have such a large range. Because, for example, some of the land that you have here is located on Fort Belvoir, which I assume would not charge the state of Virginia for building on, given it's already owned by the government. It wouldn't require condemnation or land acquisition or whatever. And you guys haven't really, I guess, delved into that level of detail where constructing these lines might be a lot cheaper than it is in other areas, because you're either building on existing rail right away, on existing government land, or there's already land bought for stations, or in some places, or whatever. You haven't looked at any of those kinds of details. This is just sort of like Metro generally costs between this and this per mile, and stations typically cost between this and this. And so we're just being really broad here, right?
That's correct.
Okay. Thanks.
All right, so in terms of kind of process, this last slide. Sorry. The last slide on the screen is really to kind of show you, it's like we're looking at a big map and this is the dot that says you are here. And so the work that has happened over the past year to look at really the art of the possible or feasibility for these different alternatives is in this gray box at the top of this flow chart. So what we have done, and to Senator Sorrell's point, where we are wrapping this effort up is with that feasibility study and some very preliminary planning level cost estimates, analysis of the cost estimate, analysis of benefits. So we're at a very, very high level. Whatever alternatives move forward have a pretty well-defined path ahead of them. To Delegate Guzman's point about federal funding, there is a very structured process to step through for federal funding participation in projects like this. So Fairfax County is going through that, or has been going through that with the Federal Transit Administration for the Richmond Highway BRT project, but it's a process of walking through with a singular alternative, project development, the environmental review, that red text selection of a locally preferred alternative, that's where you really get to this is what we want to build and this is what we are coalescing as a region behind. From there, there's getting the constrained long-range plan updated. Federal Transit Administration has a very detailed project evaluation, rating, and approval process. Then you get into engineering. That engineering process, that's where all those negotiations happen about funding and governance and land use change, another FTA evaluation before you would get a full funding grant agreement, which is full funding from the feds is about 50%. And get to construction. So that's for the projects that would go through that federal process. It would be a little, I would say more streamlined and less structured if other funding sources were identified and federal was not desired, of course. So I have some more questions. It's hard for me to tell what order these come in, so I'm sorry. Senator Sorrell is always at the top of the list. So I don't know. Senator Sorrell, if you want to go first, or if you would like to defer to Supervisor Bodie or Delegate Guzman, however you would like.
Well, let me see if I can try and ask stuff to get clarity on things. So the way we did this on the yellow line extension into Fairfax, the two-stop extension, which is currently assumed, is we did this feasibility study, or we did one multimodal alternative analysis study with the RPT, right? And then they came up with this phase stuff, 4 phases of that. And before the county applied, even with NVTA or Smart Scale or any of that, they completely rewrote the comprehensive plan for the corridor before they did anything. And I don't see anything in here about a comprehensive plan rewrite or sort of where the local government goes and redoes their comp plan to assume transit and assume the densities and all that kind of stuff. And I assume that has to happen at some point in this process. And so anyways, I don't see that in here, and I was curious about that, number one. Number two, I know New Starts has been the operating paradigm now for 15 years, I guess. I was curious in any of the new legislation that's pending at the federal level, whether it's still going to be New Starts or whether there's going to be new funding streams available that with different types of metrics or different programs or different stages or steps or whatever. Because New Starts, I think started in maybe 2010 or something, or I forget which version of the T-bills it came into, whether it was ICE-T or I don't know, Smart T or whatever they all were. So anyway, my second question was whether there's any new federal funding paradigms for transit that are either already passed or about to pass. I haven't been really paying attention to that. And the third thing is well, I guess that's it for now. Those are my 2 questions right now.
great questions as always, Senator Somerville. So you are 100% correct. This slide does not say comprehensive plan changes because we're kind of following the federal slide or federal process. But in this blue box, you have begin implementing land use changes, zoning, and incentives, and that's really the implementation piece of the comp plan. So while the comp plan's not on here, the slide does try to acknowledge that those things need to be in place and need to be implemented before you get to a full funding grant agreement with FTA. So earlier rather than later is where that would need to happen.
Right, but also, my recollection is when I called and spoke with the FTA about new starts in the middle of all this, trying to get Fairfax County to move things along. My recollection is that these things don't have to be sort of seriatim. That is, you can do a lot of these things at the exact same time. You can have your application in for FTA at the same time you're still trying to figure out your alternative or something. It might not be the best way to do it, but you can do a lot of these things in parallel and not one and then the other and the other and the other. So it's stretched out like a super long time frame, right? So
there is some overlap, but there are places in the process that once you start that step of the process, you have a specific time, a finite time period that you have to complete that step, or your project's not moving along, at a pace quick enough for the process. Tom, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree that showing progress earlier makes the project more competitive. So the more you've got consensus around the locally preferred alternative, we've highlighted adoption in the CLRP, but I think adoption in the local comp plans would also be, something you'd want to show. The begin implementing land use highlights the fact that there are actual FTA ratings where you would get scored based on have you actually put zoning in place, have you put affordable housing in place. So that's all that is indicating where that fits into the FTA approval, but I think you're totally right that getting the comp plans updated is an important step in the process.
And with regard to the pending federal bill, I have not gotten into the details of any procedural changes. I think the big takeaway is that there's based on what's currently out there about a 30% increase in funding available for these types of projects. So that certainly helps to move those projects forward.
But it's still under new start.
Again, I haven't gotten into the details. Tom, I don't know if you have, but I think we're waiting to see what gets passed.
Well, I just remember that when we went through this again for the Yellow Line extension, it seemed like everything that DRPT and or the consultants, everybody was assuming in determining feasibility and funding and everything else, was assuming working through the New Starts program and trying to hit the criteria that the feds were looking for in terms of densities within certain ranges of stations, and there were affordable housing requirements or no net loss of affordable housing requirements, I think, that are built into that, and other cost metrics that they look at. I mean, for example, I've heard the Silver Line would never have qualified for New Starts funding if it had existed. New Starts existed when the Silver Line was planned out. So, I'm assuming there's no changes to any of that kind of stuff. You don't know. Yeah. Okay.
There's a lot in that legislation, and it takes a lot to work through what's in there. And
all right. Thanks.
I have not looked at that in detail yet. Supervisor Bodie, would you like to go next?
Actually, I'll defer to Delegate Guzman. Let's go in order.
All right. Delegate Guzman. Sorry, I'm going to list somewhere.
Thank you. No, you're fine. Thank you, Supervisor Bodie. I think one thing that is clear to me is that we need to bring our federal delegation on board with this project. So how do we incorporate them in the process? Because I think at this point, what I would like to propose is to bring their offices to already be looking at the project, and we have very good stakeholders in Virginia. This includes Jerry Connolly, I think Representative Connolly, District, Don Beyer, but then we have Congressman Wexton, who serves in appropriations and transportations, and then we have Representative Elaine Luria, who is in the armed services, and this service will improve the life of military families, because we're talking about having Fort Belvoir and Quantico in the area. So as well as Rob Whitman, of course, Representative Whitman. So I think as I'm a lobby, I do lobbying, I'm policy advocacy for a living. So I would love to know more about that process, because I think they have to participate, and I don't want anyone, to lose excitement about the price tag attached to this project without incorporating the federal government in the process.
Yeah, very good point, Delegate Guzman. We have for the congressional elected officials, senators, Virginia senators, they've all been included in our communications on this study and invited to these briefings, and we have had their staff participate in these briefings as well. So that we have laid a foundation for that, but that is a very good point. Supervisor Bodie?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I appreciate the comments of my colleagues on this. And I'm going to be that guy and to get a little bit more into that question in regards to that, especially that red section, and also to begin implementing land use changes. Because to me, this sort of generalizes and simplifies what will actually be, in my opinion, a lot more complex than it looks, because there are layers to land use, right? We have our comp plan, which Senator Sturvell rightfully mentioned, but we also have the zoning that underlies that land use designation. Then in terms of incentives, we have project-specific incentives for any given land use case that comes before us. So there's a lot embedded in there that I think will have to be sort of talked through in regards to that. But in terms of that red section specifically, this is a multi-jurisdictional, multi-agency body project, and I guess my question in terms of process is, how would that process go to designate that locally preferred route? Would that be us passing a resolution as a Board of Supervisors here in Prince William County, and the Fairfax folks doing the same? And then also would the transit authorities, PRTC, NVTA, and VTC also have their own preferred ways of doing that? Would they adopt resolutions? What if, one locality or one body prefers one or the other? Talking about that, but actually, especially specifically, is I don't want to see this as an or situation, because as Senator Sturvell alluded to earlier, in some cases, some of these concepts can be bridge concepts. So, the short term could be expanding express bus service, and, short mid would be BRT. And then medium term would be looking at those VRE extensions and a more expansive BRT in phases. And then ultimately, since it's a decade plus long process, is doing that metro. So to sort of compress that timeline, so we're not having to go through a series of different grant approvals and things over the next 30 or 40 years. How are we able to grapple that, especially in terms of us looking at this as not an or solution, but an and solution? I hope that makes sense.
No, it definitely makes sense, and I think that's why we've been, I would say, somewhat cautious in how we have framed the findings of this study, because I think there's a lot more discussion to be had around regional consensus and all those different bodies that you mentioned coalescing around a phasing or a particular alternative or a package of alternatives. And I think what we're trying to do with this study is not say this is better than this, or this is the preferred alternative, or this is a recommendation, but is to give you a good foundation of information for the region to have those kinds of conversations to decide where you want to go from here. I think where we kind of landed is, all of these different project elements. I mean, we have to look at them in order to evaluate them kind of, in a little bit of a stovepipe and by themselves. And I think your point that, it's a combination or a phased process, like we can't do that in trying to evaluate the merits of each one of these alternatives at this level. But there's a lot of value in doing exactly what you said. As a region coming together and figuring out how to best kind of piece those different project elements together.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll add to that is because especially as we talk about costs and bringing in the conversation that Delegate Guzman started, is there's a world where we also have different funding streams for different segments of what this is. You know, NBRC funds projects all across the region in terms of various things. We recently got DRPT money for a study in regards to alternative fuel sources for buses. Thank you for that DRPT to PRTC for that. So there's just so much here and so many overlapping jurisdictions and regional agencies and things like that this will be a process long after this study is done. I just think that we have to be cognizant of that, and I hope that as a region and as local jurisdictions we continue down this process, that we're able to have those agencies, those regional bodies and those localities not only talk to each other but also have touch points back with you all as we continue down this course, so we can make sure that what we're doing continues to be informed by the work that you guys did on this study.
Yeah, absolutely, and Supervisor Brady very well stated. We, even though we have a report to file to meet a legislative requirement, we remain available and want to partner with the region as that conversation continues. So, technical help, whatever it is, and whatever best our role can be, certainly we are here to provide that support and to be part of the continuing conversation.
Appreciate that. Thank you so much.
All right, so as we wrap up, our next steps are we're getting down to the finish line. As I said, we got started. We are working to post a draft on our website. We will, we heard you today, we got some more feedback today. That will likely not make it into a draft. We'll see, we'll talk, Tim and Tom and I can talk, and we'll try to get that into the draft report, but our goal is to get that out there so that we can get some public comment before that report, some additional public comment before that report is submitted. And then again, we will wrap that up, submit the report to the General Assembly, and then what's not on the slide, but to your point, Supervisor Bodie, then it's, where do we go next? And we stand ready to support the region in those conversations.
Hello, Senator Parker. Hello,
Senator Parker.
Yeah, I've been on for a while, but we're just mostly listening. I'm driving back from Richmond, but I wasn't on at the beginning. One thing I think that I haven't heard while I've been on, that maybe talked about earlier, is how do you calculate the impact in terms of job creation in Prince William in particular? Because Prince William, a majority, if every job in Prince William was held by someone who lived in Prince William, we would still have the majority of the people in Prince William having to drive outside of the county to get to their job. And it's the only large jurisdiction like that in the state. And clearly what we found in a lot of situations is that when someone was going to do a major project, they, for the metropolitan area, they would specifically say it has to be a metro station within that area there. And so in terms of job creation, we've been very hampered in Prince William. And it seems to me that is one of the things that would benefit, where there would be significant benefit, and then it should start to turn around the job creation in Prince William, and allow a lot more people who live in Prince William to be able to work there. And Prince William also not only has a lack of jobs, but there's not too many ways to go north or east out of Prince William with the water crossings and everything. So all those are significant issues that I think need to be looked at in some way. I don't know how much of that has been done thus far and where we are on that.
Yeah, that's a great point, Senator Parker. And we did some sensitivity analysis in the land use part of the study that looked at building up and creating more jobs in that Route 1 corridor and in this, these potential Metrorail alternatives and really shifting more of the employment development and housing development to the eastern side of Prince William County, and what would that do in terms of ridership on transit? Certainly, it makes any of these alternatives much more viable, and then, to your point, help stimulate more people staying within Prince William County, to work instead of commuting.
It's both a tax benefit to the county, because there's not that much collected in terms of commercial taxes on properties, but also has positive impact for a lot of people who don't have to drive an hour and a half each way to get to their job.
Yeah. Very good point, Senator Barker. All right. Well, thanks everybody. I know we ran over, and I apologize for that, but we had this has been very very helpful to us as continue to get feedback and input to get you a study that helps meet your needs in terms of the next steps for alternatives in this corridor. We are very grateful for all of you taking the time to do this today. If you have any other questions, Supervisor Bailey.
Yes, this is Tanya James. No, I'm just I just wanted to say thank you for the presentation as well, and I wanted to just apologize to my delegates, Delegate Guzman and my Senator Servo. I was running late, so I thought I was running late to ask my question. So thank you for allowing me to go first. No disrespect intended. I know they know me, but I just wanted to say that. And for the next steps as well, because I think that's so essential as we move forward with this and trying to be, as Senator Servo had said, being ahead of the curve, and working in concert with you. So the next steps are very important. So thank you. That's all I want.
Thank you. That we will wrap up today's briefing. If you have any questions or like my follow-up, please don't hesitate to contact Tim or to contact me. We're happy to help. And so thanks everybody for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day. Thank you for all your hard work.
Yeah, everyone.
Thank you. Appreciate all the help. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.